Hello, welcome to Research Talk, Qualitative Scholar Conversations. I'm Mark Vagle. I'm the first of the scholars being interviewed around the course for the spring series. The course via Zoom will be 5 principles for designing and carrying out our qualitative research, June 5th through 6th. Today I'm here with Maietta and Jeff Petruzzelli, and we're going to be talking about the course.
Great. So, Mark, we were hoping we could start out, and just for the benefit of folks who don't yet know you, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and evolution as a qualitative researcher, and then we'll move into stuff about the course, how you came to conceive of the course, and very flexible in terms of how that goes. But if you could start out and let our audience know a bit more about you.
Great. Thank you, Ray. I started with qualitative research in the early 2000s during my PhD program. Prior to my PhD program, I knew about research more generally, pretty much assumed and situated research, whether I knew it or not, in more quantitative, positivistic ways of asking questions and conducting maybe not direct experiments and such, but collecting data in more numerical form and doing statistical work. I hadn't studied that much. I just assumed that's what research was. Right away in my doctoral program, I was introduced to qualitative research. I wasn't skeptical like some of the other folks in my program. I was pretty drawn to it. And then from there, I ended up studying all sorts of ways to do qualitative research. One of the beauties of the program I took at the University of Minnesota is that we were required to take not only general qualitative research methodology courses, but also specific research methodology courses in coming out of various traditions, ethnography, phenomenology, grounded theory, and many options to choose from. So that was a gift. And then when I completed my doctorate and took my first position at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia, by that time I had become pretty well steeped in phenomenology as a tradition, both the philosophical orientation and the what I call big M methodological research design, sets of commitments, and then the on the ground of how to collect. I still worked across a number of qualitative methodologies, but that was my primary methodology. Started becoming a practicing qualitative researcher as directly part of my job as a professor, and then became fairly drawn fairly early in my work as an assistant professor to post-structuralist epistemologies and ontologies, and some of the methodologies that had gotten created from post-structuralism. And I started to tinker with different ways in which some of those post-structuralist informed methodologies could be put in conversation with some of the commitments in phenomenological and in qualitative methodologies writ large. And over time, maybe now about 15-ish years ago, I developed out what I've called post-intentional phenomenology. Again, bridging or bringing in phenomenology and post-structuralism. And then I've kind of moved deeper into post-intentional and stepped back and tried to think about some of the implications and possibilities coming out of post-intentional phenomenology and how they could be potentially useful to qualitative researchers working across any number of methodologies, as well as saying they would like to situate their work in qualitative research writ large. And so the last 4 or 5 years or so, I've been working in earnest to try to be able to engage qualitative researchers more broadly using some of the commitments that come out of my post-intentional phenomenology. And this course, which I'll talk about more in a moment, is a result of some of that thinking and theorizing and teaching I've done.
Can you just, for the benefit of folks who aren't familiar, give 1 to 2 sentences about post-structuralism just to orient folks who aren't familiar with it?
Right. Thank you. Yeah, to me, a couple quick key points of post-structuralism is that knowledge is always partial. It's always deeply situated in time and space, and it's always deferred. And by deferred, it means that we're constantly looking more for in post-structuralism, for how things connect with one another, possibly, and not so much what they quote unquote are. So the belief is things aren't present or not present. They're constantly being constructed in and over time. And we try to get a glimpse of some of those possibilities as knowledge and insights continually become.
As I'm listening to you, I'm caught up in a really good way about the movement of you as methodologist. And I could relate when you first started talking about coming to grad school and thinking of, as a, more quantitative orientation. I don't know if you know this, but my nickname in grad school was Stat Boy. So I now tell people who start with quantitative in our classes, if they're nervous, that I tell them there's hope for them because it worked for me. So, but the other piece of this is as you go through and you talked about, not just the courses you took, but movement into phenomenology and thinking of this. I was envisioning a triangle of the philosophical pieces, the methodological pieces, and the how-to, if you will, and kind of that link. And it almost feels to me like that focus has now led to this piece of the post-structural, post-intentional. But that triangle of the philosophical points, the methodological, and the doing, it sounds like those are happening simultaneously, and you get to the point where you don't have to be strictly minded about it, that it's kind of, it just seems as you're presenting this to be a real flow with those things when you're doing your thing in the field and working.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good way to envision it. I think I'm reminded of a number of conversations are coming to the forefront of my mind in classes when I'm trying to teach, like what you just described. Those three points on a triangle is I think a good way to visualize it. And sometimes for some people, they want to at least start thinking about them separate from one another. And then what often happens, to your point, is oftentimes we don't always realize how the flow is happening among them,
right?
Until we converse. And when we're conversing, we start moving among them without kind of knowing it. And so in the range of people who are like, wait, can you tell me more about one of these 3 points? We start there, but then it just bleeds into the others intentionally, sometimes, but mostly unintentionally.
That expression bleeds into is, I love the way you're, first you're kind of talking about the ideas integrated in these kinds of things, but the pace and movement and, the completeness of the idea bleeds into is beautiful, the way that kind of flows. One of the things that folks talk a lot about, and just for the benefit of other folks, we don't just take the classes, teach the classes with folks like Mark and our scholar team. We talk about this stuff as well. But when folks think about taking and enrolling in your courses, which in the past have been primarily phenomenological, and that phenomenology in some form was in the title, and we made a conscious choice here to move, people worry about accessibility, and they worry about their ability to do what you're going to present to them. And there's always been this anticipated distance in the ability to understand and execute whether it's not just you, whatever they may read in a book about phenomenology, whatever they may take in a course. And when we think about this idea of the philosophy, the method, the how-to, and that kind of link, there's another level. People, when we find newer to Qual, what they want us to give them first, almost like a security blanket of sorts, is just give me the step-by-step and just let me go there. But this movement that you're now going when you're fast forward to your evolution of how you've been thinking currently about this idea of the 5 principles for designing and carrying out research, and how they really are grounded firmly in your intellectual work, your publications, your teaching, your supervising of students and other researchers. When you talked about, well, wait a minute, these core ideas apply writ large to qual. And there's a strength to that. And as we were setting up this course and we were looking through that, I was excited. And when I think about our schedule, it's June 5th, that's fine, but I don't want to wait that long to kind of witness it in execution. But that movement from where you started your learning as a qual researcher in general and kind of the approaches, all those things, it almost feels like there's a circle back of now, wait a minute, here is, of course, I still am grounded in your work now in post-intentional phenomenology in the phenomenology world, but I don't want to lose for folks that this isn't something that's meant to just be people in the phenomenology club. So that's one of the things I just wanted to hear a little bit more about is how you envision cutting back to this idea of the accessibility things, people adapting and integrating the content of what you're going to present without the fear of, oh, phenomenology is hard to understand, and implement the ideas that really are firmly linked, whether we acknowledge it or not, to phenomenology into what you're doing. Like, people wonder, I'm going to take this class, say, on Thursday or Friday, and then when I start my work on Monday, like, what do you envision that looking like? How do you envision folks uptaking the content that you're presenting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So I'm really excited about this course. I've done, as both of you know, I've done parts of this in different forms with a little
Yes.
different central focus to it. I'm excited to, for the first time, very explicitly and from the start, work on like qualitative researching as a practice and way of being, but have that very simultaneously uh, be located in concrete work of research design and data collection and or analysis. So the idea, not the idea, the one of the main purposes of the course is people bring where they're at in their research design and or, like the title directly says, carrying out of research. So bring data with, bring research design sketches or the plan or a draft to this course. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go through the 5 principles that, again, draw on phenomenology, but we'll spend very little time with phenomenology. We'll spend a little bit of time at the beginning trying to get our head around what a phenomenon is as a qualitative researcher, and to make that like less of a big word that sometimes gets perceived as like a phenomenon, as mystical, like happening that we can't quite explain. It actually meaning the opposite, a super concrete, vexing, challenging lived experience as a qualitative researcher, as we've designed and are trying to carry out our research. So for example, when I did a similar version of this before, people brought issues they were experiencing as a researcher, specifically around, at least a third of the people were around interviewing. And so they were doing interviews and they were finding it difficult. They were finding stuck spots or moments where they didn't feel as confident. So what we did is we worked collectively, and then I worked some individually with people to try to identify that stuck spot and then work these 5 principles on the stuck spot. One thing different about this workshop, or rather course, is that it's going to focus on not only the issue people might be facing as qualitative researchers, but we'll be working the principles on concrete data when you bring data, or design questions or features, so that it's a both working, doing some self examination, if you will, of like, why am I stuck here? Where's my stuck spot? But doing it so that there's an unstuckness, right?
Yeah.
Like in the moment. So we'll work on solving the problem, which will involve some reflection, right? On ourselves as qualitative researchers. And I'll model out some of my stuck spots as a researcher and such. So I'm really stoked on the both and possibilities here in the course.
So the course starts 5 principles. And as you were talking about how people will be engaging and learning, those 5 principles, I guess to some degree, you do have to teach here's principle 1, 2, and 3.
Right.
But it sounds like in application, they're not worked on in isolation. So I just envision that you bringing folks to a place where their mind's got to be pretty active as they're thinking through, to use a word you just said that was just perfectly chosen, when you're thinking about what it is you want to understand, it should be vexing. And it's an investment. Like if something's vexing, you're invested in it. But as you're invested in this topic, these 5 ideas don't play on their own, do they? These 5 principles.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, they're definitely integrated with one another, and like they're iterative. They build and feed off one another. And once they're engaged, what I've found, and I've applied these 5 principles in many different kinds of contexts. And so these principles are going to be, of course, applied to the work of qualitative research as we're carrying out again and designing our qualitative research. So what I anticipate happening, and to Ray, to your earlier point or observation, yes, they'll be at the beginning, like a fairly quick dive into here are the 5 principles, right? Like a more of like the direct instruction, if you will, about them, but pretty swiftly on purpose so that we can then start working them with what people bring as qualitative researchers to the course. And what I anticipate is once we've experienced this, especially throughout the first day, that when we get into second day, what tends to happen when I work with people on the principles is that they start making choices for themselves on where they want to zero in. Like they might want to grab hold of principle 2, which, for example, really focuses on examining how context influences and shapes whatever vexing lived experience, vexing issue we're facing. Okay, so maybe someone really wants to start on day 2 going deep into context and how it's shaping the context of the study, the institution. The last study I did as a researcher is shaping this next study, even though I didn't really intend it to. That can happen. So I need to figure out what to do, right? With this other study I did that was similar, but not the same, as an example now, right? And then maybe they spend a lot of time working 2, and that spills into 3, which
Yeah.
is slowing down what you've noticed in your contextual analysis to try to really open it up more. And so then we go through a process of what I'm meaning by slow down to open up, which is kind of basically in one way questioning aspects of what we notice about our own practice as qualitative researchers and what we're noticing in the study we've designed or are carrying out, and like questioning aspects of it that we maybe would take for granted most of the time. We try to slow down and kind of pretend like we don't know all the answers that we actually do pretty much know, because it could like dislodge something a little bit to give us just a little bit of different insight that we
Yeah.
might not have otherwise. So maybe people work 2 and 3 a bunch together and they stay there. And
Right.
someone else is working 4, as examples.
As you talk about this and we think more about it, it feels like terminology is always a challenge for us, right? So we introduce these as principles. I think it's perfectly fine. I think it fits, it works well. But as you expose me more to how you apply and conceive of these, they're also strategies at the same time. They're principle
Mhm.
strategies. And when we get to that thing we were talking about earlier, that triangle, right? The philosophy, the method, and the how-to piece, they're tools. And then when we shift to the fourth, this idea of, try to see what frames are seen, and moving from context, moving through to that. This is, again, to me, it's like intellectually humbling, where we really kind of don't just go with our interpretation, but not just is the data contextualized, so is where we move with it.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's the other piece of this when we think about pushing these ideas, which started very clearly in your work, crafting phenomenological research, and much more than, of course, just that book. But they are definitely parallels and connections to the other qual traditions. We don't have to talk about them deeply now, but as someone who's co-authored a piece about the qual traditions, it's always been fascinating to me that people push to, I want to box each one of these. So I know what grounded theory is. So I know what phenomenology is. So then when I shift and I go to ethnography, I know what that is. And we've concentrated so much folks have concentrated in their scholarship on the differences and trying to make them distinct. But what's much more intriguing to me is, what are the shared qualities, and how do we push what we're doing in a way that really influences the field? And as you continue to talk, that's one of the things that's really intriguing to me, this movement of you and circling back to this general core for qualitative. As people get what you're presenting and start applying and implementing, what implications do you see for qual folks, new to qual, experienced qual folks, as they start to really see, oh, wait a minute, this getting these principles grounded, understanding the methodological integrity, the how-to, thinking that these principles are iterative and also you co-engage with them. How do you see this changing what we're doing and thinking and how we're engaging in our qualitative work when we're, clock starts, job starts, we're now working at our desk?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A couple, my first two immediate thoughts is, first of all, I really love how you worked from principle to strategy to tool. I agree with you. These 5 principle, strategies, tools can and should be seen in all those ways. And so I also then encourage people to take them up in ways that work for them, right? So if it works for one qualitative researcher to think of them as looser principles that they can kind of just have informing them with the tools and strategies they already have from other spaces and places, great. If it works better for the next qualitative researcher to say, I actually want and need to think of these principles as direct tools and strategies, and I'm going to grab hold of the ones and the aspects of each one that feel like more directly like, here's the tool or strategy of this principle. Here's like the piece of it that I know I can pick up and grab, as we've said in other spaces before, or you've suggested, really, like on Monday morning, right, at your desk, right? And so I really like that a lot. So I think it can definitely influence these tool strategies, principles can influence qualitative researchers, especially when and if it resonates, right? So it's like invitation oriented toward these tools and strategies. And this connects to a bridge to the second point, is as iterative as they are, it's not like people can't take one or two of them that speak to them as a tool or strategy the most and put it to work. So you mentioned this principle 4, see what frames you're seeing. So it's not some just open in a vacuum neutral interpretation we do, right? It's always framed by any number of things we're conscious of or less conscious of. So to say I could see a qualitative researcher across any number of kinds or traditions within qualitative research as a field saying, like, I'm going to do a lot of work on what's framing during my analysis. I want to spend more time, slowing that down and really thinking through what is it about how I see the world, what I've experienced, what I assume about how the world works, about how this context or space works, how this conversation or issue in the field that I'm studying and that I'm situated in tends to believe around this issue. Those are all framing how I'm seeing these data. And so that's not a problem. We can't escape that. It's just what do we know about that frame? How do we try to locate it, make sense of it, decide whether we want to try to incorporate another frame, keep that frame, modify it. I think so. Just as an example, that principle can be taken up without necessarily people having to work all five or do them step by step. So don't need to wait for that. So I think that's a positive that it could influence qualitative research more broadly.
It's fabulous. And so many people have this assumption that if it's research, it must be systematic, it must be step by step. And you're almost giving people like this cognitive permission slip to work ideas. And this iterative doesn't mean you must do principle strategy tool 1, then 2, then 3. Is no, there are many different points of orientation, points of progression, points of movement. And the decisions in that movement are much more fluid, don't have to be concrete. They're driven as much by you as they are by not just one piece of data, but all of it as it continues to come in, and kind of where your mind moves now that you've processed through 7, let's say you did interviews. So it's not just vexing, but it also sounds like this should be kind of compelling, engaging. There's a certain amount of I'm now moving and I'm totally present to my work. It just feels like it's a plan to bring us who are geeks and we're kind of minded in what we're doing. And it just brings us to a point where, yeah, don't worry about strict rule boundedness, and it's pretty inviting. Jeff, as we're thinking through this, I just want to kind of, we have one more question, Mark. We could keep going, but we'll ask that in a moment. But I just wanted to check in with Jeff. Anything you're wondering and thinking as we're, kind of just really expounding on what folks can look at on our website in the course description?
Yeah, Mark, you brought up lived experience, and certainly that's a term that we use as qualitative researchers all the time. We really want to try to get at the lived experience and understand the lived experience of our participants. But as I was listening to you talk, I kind of was starting to think that it's not only the lived experience of our participants, but it's the lived experience of ourselves as researchers that also plays a role in this process. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and kind of bring that forward as to how it figures into what you're doing.
Great question. Yeah, I agree with you fully. And so the term, the kind of across multiple qualitative traditions that is used quite a bit is, paying attention to our own researcher reflexivity, right? And our positionality. And inherent in that is, as Jeff is pointing out, our own lived experiences. And it could be, for example, with the issue or topic or phenomenon that we're studying. So in the course, it'll be interesting because my gut tells me, based on experience, that most of us end up studying things that at some distant or even not so distant way are autobiographical. And it's not that we're doing autobiographical accounts when we're trying to learn about other people's lived experiences, but usually we can kind of trace back the things we study to something we've experienced way back, or someone else we know close to us, or we've wondered about it deeply in the field or really curious about it. So sometimes we might literally have a lived experience with the thing we're studying. So that's a really interesting thing to think about, and how that, with principles 4 and 5, are framing are what we're doing when we're studying and designing and carrying out our research. So that's one thing we'll explore a little bit. I'm also thinking, Jeff, in regards to your question, that our own lived experiences as qualitative researchers over time, depending on where we're at in our own journey with qualitative inquiry, is that our lived experiences as researchers are framing and influencing whatever we're studying in the current study. And I think some reflection, and when I say reflection, it doesn't, I think sometimes, to maybe this beckons back to what some of the things Ray commented on earlier. Sometimes when a phenomenologist says we're going to reflect and reflects on something, some people get concerned that we're gonna spend like 3 hours just dwelling with. Okay, so like we of course could do that, but in the course we won't. Okay, reflection and being reflexive about our own lived experiences can be awfully quick as well. It can be like, think of a moment when,
Yeah.
wow, that you've thought of that moment, ask 3 questions of it. What did you see? What did you think? What did you feel at that moment? Now pay attention to the language that you use in recollecting it, the way your body feels at those moments. If when you're thinking about how you felt, does your body re-feel it a little bit? Okay, what might that feel like? And then boom, how might that be influencing this current study you're working on? Now, it wouldn't be as fast as I just rattled through it here, but it also wouldn't take 3 hours, right? That could be a 10-minute exercise right there. That could even be shortened once we start to use it more as a tool or a strategy on the fly in our practice. And so I'm excited that in the course we'll be practicing these strategies, learning them, working them immediately on current work we're working on. So yeah, I'm pretty jazzed about all that.
That's great. Yeah, it sounds like it's really a great opportunity or a great way for people to really become more present in their work as well. So, rather than you're just studying this topic, you're actually immersing yourself into it as well.
Yeah, it's a great observation.
Jeff, in that way too, I'm thinking about researcher reflexivity, Mark, and the different ways people have engaged it and thought about it. And so much of that conversation for us in a strong way applies to interests of researchers being transparent and accountable to their work. But it's much more than that, isn't it? When we move to Jeff's point about how it brings us to be present and we look at the points you just made, it also helps us get some grounding where necessary, but also movement in the ways that we have an expression at ResearchTalk in our work, in our sort and sit book, let the data be your guide. So this deep reflexivity also moves the way that you're shaping where your mind's going over the whole project and the content of it. So it's not just this tool for ethical responsibility to transparency and accountability. It really is this vehicle for researchers to keep kind of progressing on the current project and in general. It's pretty well-rounded. It's pretty exciting. We wanted to just close and ask you if there's anything that you might bring people's attention to, work you've done in the past, a book, an article, or maybe just a quick short story of experience, but something concrete that people can kind of conceptualize, think about, maybe read on their own if it is a book, that has helped bring you to this place. I love that this is a lot of things that have been vexing for you that you've been working on. And, of course, the content and substance of your work has driven a lot, but you're a methodologist and this is one of the things you've done. So it's kind of interesting to see all of that take shape. And we've had now a wonderful, over a decade's relationship with you. So it's wonderful to see how that's flowed. But yeah, just the shortcut is anything that you could, kind of think about, book, article, experience that you might bring folks to, or just give a little bit of a short, hey, keep in mind via that.
Yeah, thanks. I think even though the book is crafting phenomenological research is obviously centering phenomenology, I think that's a good resource to go to. I'm just about finished with the 3rd edition, and it'll come out after the after this course. It'll come out late summer of 2024. And that'll have a number of the things, or some of the things we've discussed today with regard to these 5 principles in a very introductory way. So more is going to be coming out on the 5 principles, which also means the course will be kind of still in the front end of what's out there in writing. It's been a journey of, for lack of a better phrase, good old-fashioned R&D, of research and development on it, working with a lot of different people over time. But the crafting phenomenological research would have the base for it, and it would be, and it's written trying to be as accessible as possible to a very philosophically oriented methodology. But also has the quality somewhat like the course, where to pick and choose what you maybe want to grab. There's a number of articles of using phenomenology and post-intentional phenomenology in particular in practice. And so I think those could be really good. There's a piece in the Journal of Curriculum Studies that could be interesting for people to read. There's 1 or 2 in qualitative inquiry. I think that could be really, really, possible for people to see it in action, and can, take or leave the deep phenomenological setup of it and go to where you see it in action. I think those could be helpful as well as potential resources to know like the underpinning some of this, because we won't spend time on the foundations of phenomenology in those spaces as much. And the other thing I'd encourage is just to go to my Google Scholar account, and what I found fascinating is just clicking all the citations to crafting phenomenological research, and then like skimming through all the different parts of the world and throughout the US that people have been using the work in all the different fields. About every field I could list, there's been someone drawing on some aspect of the work. And then there's where I think it could be the most helpful, because there are plenty of people outside of phenomenology who are drawing on a point or 2 from crafting that helped them with their case study. Okay, so they didn't take the whole methodology, which is back to Ray's point earlier of like not having these be so separated among our methodological traditions within qualitative inquiry. But there's been plenty of people who've cited across, right, and grabbed hold of a tool or a strategy or a commitment from phenomenology that I write about in that book in crafting phenomenological research, and then they've again applied it to a whole different qualitative methodology, which I think is cool when people see possibilities that way and give themselves and or others they work with are giving them permission as well to do that type of crosswalking.
Wonderful. And if we'll get that information from you, if that's okay with you, and we'll make sure we get that available to everybody. So I want to, of course, thank you for your time, Mark. But just as we close up our first conversation in our Research Talk Qualitative Scholar Conversations, again, I'm Ray Maietta, Jeff Petruzzelli, my colleague, who's our qualitative research specialist at ResearchTalk. But Mark's course, again, is 5 Principles for Designing and Carrying Out Qualitative Research. It'll be offered via Zoom, June 5th and 6th. Registration's available now at ResearchTalk's website under our upcoming events page. But again, we'll get some resources available for folks, but Mark Vagle will be integrating these ideas, continuing to go and develop them in concert with you over those 2 days if you're able to attend. So thank you very much again, Mark, for your time. And of course, always thank you, Jeff. So we look forward to what's coming up here in a couple months. So